What sense of character can you glean from the soul in Deltarune? Well, plenty, really. For one thing, the soul is the design element that connects Deltarune to Undertale. It is in fact the character that is most connected to Undertale because you, the player, know the most about Undertale compared to the cast of Deltarune. If Deltarune is a parallel narrative to Undertale, then you, the soul, are the tether that links them. Like in Chapter 1's epilogue, you can say that it's great to see Sans again despite him being new in town. You can bring up Alphys to Undyne despite the two not knowing each other until Chapter 2. Chris has no reason to bring this up. They're an asocial weirdo prankster, and Sans makes a pun about sleeping with their mom in the conversation where the two meet each other, which means that those are soul dialogue options, also known as you. I think the soul's character shows itself the most in the Shadow Crystal bosses. First of all, the form changes are yet another stark connection to Undertale, but I want to focus on the prelude to the Spamton Neo fight, because when the soul shifts to its yellow justice, that's not Chris, that's us. Everything that requires player input is the soul, and everything outside of that is Chris. Defending Susie from the king was all Chris, because that's a cutscene. Firing off these big shots is us. It requires player input to proceed. In fact, look at Chris, they're collapsed in their roller coaster. So you as the soul can just use game mechanics like this, I guess. Probably under specific conditions, but able to nonetheless. So many mysteries in this game. But yeah, the soul is everything the player can do. Duh. But also, I think it's fascinating when Deltarune highlights everything the soul can't do. For example, the soul's vision is explicitly limited by a classic top-down JRPG viewpoint. When the soul lacks a vessel, it also loses its narrator and Chris, limiting the way you can glean information from the world. The soul cannot properly play piano because, yes, Chris's will, but also because our controller scheme limits our ability to interact with certain objects. Basically, Chris lives in the world of Deltarune, while the soul can only play with it. Isn't that interesting? That despite its extra-dimensional nature, the soul is most easily defined by its inability to live in another world. Escapism, huh? Despite the player's presence in the narrative, we certainly are caged, don't you think? Chris Dreamer is the protagonist of Deltarune, much to their annoyance, but despite their mysterious character, there's still quite a bit that can be gleaned from their design. Obviously, as a member of the Dreamer family, the green shirt with the yellow stripe calls back to Kara from Undertale. If you remember, a design philosophy from Undertale is that striped shirts indicate children. But Chris is noticeably older than the children of Undertale, and to add to that, if you look at everyone in Chris's class, none of them have striped clothing the way that Chris does. Susie might have a striped shirt, but it's covered by her jacket, and Birdley has stripes on his sleeves, but overall, Chris is the one with a stripe as a prominent part of their design. The monster kid from Deltarune notably does not have a stripe on their shirt. So, with that in mind, I think it's not unreasonable to call Chris childish for their age. It's certainly good context for their wild, gremlin-y energy. It could also indicate them as being somewhat stuck in the past. As revealed in Chapter 4, they're certainly beholden to a promise of some kind. So yeah, there's a lot of mystery surrounding Chris's character, something they intend, which brings me to this aspect of their design, their eyes and how they're hidden from the player. Eyes are often called the window to the soul, so Chris only reveals their eyes when they're in control or otherwise sending a message. Chris is controlled by the player, and as a result, they will try their utmost to give as little of themselves away as they can for whatever goal that they have. I really love how the blank slateness of a typical video game avatar is recontextualized here as introversion, as keeping oneself hidden. Onto Chris's Dark World form, it's certainly blue. In fact, there's emphasis on how blue it is. The color blue is associated with pensive emotions like sadness, calm, and melancholy, but with context from Undertale, we know that blue is associated with the soul traits integrity and patience. Integrity in particular feels kinda ironic considering their secrets, or maybe not considering the promise they seem obliged to keep, which fits with patience as well now that I think about it. In any case, speaking of obligations and duty, there's one last obvious thing I should point out about this design. Doesn't it kind of look like a knight to you? Toriel Deltarune Dreamer is the second, third, fourth character you meet right after Chris, and the first character shown that has a direct counterpart in Undertale. And honestly, I think her presence, and the presence of the Undertale cast in general, shows how much production quality increased from Deltarune to Undertale. Like, other than an additional tuft of hair, look at how vestigial this portrait sprite is compared to the other. There's just straight up more pixels. I do think that this works for Toriel in particular, though. She's a mother, the first kind character you meet in Undertale, and her theme in Deltarune is literally called You Can Always Come Home. home, so the sheer nostalgia exuded from her sprite work is very fitting to me, at least. Look at her overworld sprite, peak kindergarten teacher energy. The thing I really want to focus on, though, is what Toriel wears in Chapter 4, because speaking of nostalgia, this is a blast from the past. Toriel's original Undertale overworld sprite gets recontextualized as altar server clothes, and that's fascinating to me. First of all, it's such a snappy way to put a spotlight on the Deltarune prophecy. I was so much more locked in on realizing how the Dark World prophecy is connected to the Light World religion because of it. And secondly, it makes me have more interest on what Toriel from Undertale is like with this new information. Did Toriel try to find guidance in religion or prophecy after separating from Asgore? Her Dark World sprite in Deltarune implies that this is what she looked like when she was Queen of the Underground. And now that I think about it, Toriel's desperation to make a home for the fallen humans kind of mirrors Ralsei's desperate hope to change the prophecy through kindness. See how my thoughts are spinning because of this? It's just such a good reuse of design. Alphys Deltarune is a teacher in the game's hometown, succeeding Gerson Boom after his passing. No matter the timeline, she's always got big shoes to fill, huh? Her portrait sprite is largely the same as in Undertale, with those buck teeth and glasses so large that they essentially are her eyes. Though notably, they're square instead of round in Deltarune, and the bridge of her glasses are a bit thinner. Maybe an implication that royal scientist Alphys needed reinforced glasses for experiments? That's just speculation though. In any case, her design is simple but adorkable in both worlds. Comparing her overworld sprite to the one she has in Undertale, it's notable how, despite the same hunched over posture, her Deltarune sprite is slightly less closed off. Like, sure, it's probably just to show off that red teacher tie, but I think it's reasonable to interpret it as her being less traumatized in the world of Deltarune. So yeah, not much to say. This is Alphys, awkward and anxious, but with presumably less trauma and sins crawling on her back. Though, with her clear love of anime, video games, and muscular superheroes, and the Dark Worlds as themes of escapism, I'd be surprised if she didn't play a bigger role in future chapters. In defiance of fate, Tem believed that Egg will have. Temmie was like a fun Easter egg character in Undertale, and I think the Temmie of Deltarune maintains this energy. This embodiment of a woo is mostly unchanged from Undertale, with her scrunkly, not a thought behind those eyes face, cat ears, and dog ears. I thought these were like headphones when I first saw them. The only real difference is that in Deltarune, Temmie's wearing a hat, which is probably an indication that this one is older. As the avatar for the artist Temmie Chang, Tem has always given off the impression of being easy to draw. Anatomy is difficult, but Temmie has eldritch, amorphous noodle arms that kind of turn anatomy into a suggestion, which is chaotic but freeing from a design standpoint. And also, Temmie as a whole has enough simple but distinct features that a sketch like this can make you go, oh yeah, that's Temmie all right. But yeah, Easter eggs. In Chapter 4, you can see Temmie at school, where through hard study, she's learned how to sing. When the light is running low. Temmie Chang's bit-crushed vocals here are a reference to when she sang Don't Forget for Toby Fox's birthday 5 years ago. Wow. In any case, it's a cute moment in-game, as vocal dialogue is not a thing in Deltarune outside of a couple cutscenes and a few songs. So yeah, Temmie's just very Temmie, retaining her quirky Easter egg energy from Undertale. Snowy and Monster Kid are a notable duo in Deltarune. In Undertale, Easter egg. Egg. Temmie's group project partner is an egg. This is played as a joke at first, but eggs hold significance in Deltarune. In fact, in that very same Tem Learn How to Sing scene, it's shown how many eggs you've collected in your current save file on Birdley's desk, the desk right next to Temmie. Does this mean Temmie plays an important role in the future? Is Temmie in some way affiliated with the Forgotten Man? Is Birdley? Birds lay eggs? I don't know. And in fact, the song, Temmie sings the song Don't Forget right next to those eggs. Forgetting. Memory. Forgotten Man. What role do you play in Chris's repressed memories, Temmie? Reveal it to me! Snowy and Monster Kid are a notable duo in Deltarune. In Undertale, they had no relation beyond being residents of Snowdin, but here they're frequently seen together, either as project partners or just hanging out. And when you think about it, this dynamic makes sense. Monster Kid has a habit of laughing when they talk, either out of general nervousness or just habit, and Snowy is the desperate class comedian that no one finds funny. I can totally see how Snowy would attach himself to Monster Kid based on the misunderstanding that they find him funny and Monster Kid just not having the heart to correct him. So yeah, hopefully that friendship lasts. Oh, also they both don't have arms. That's probably another point of bonding. Anyways, in terms of design, Snowy's based on the Snowdrake from Undertale, and the only difference here is that Snowy has a bow tie now, which definitely shows how Snowy's more connected with his father in Deltarune. Now that I think about it, this is probably the case because in Undertale, Snowy and his father have no idea what happened to their mother because of Alphys keeping everyone in the dark, only finding out the truth at the end of the pacifist route. Meanwhile, in Deltarune, Snowy's mother is just dead, which is still sad, but there's inherently more closure there. In any case, Monster Kid's design has gone through a more radical change compared to Snowy's. Radical definitely feels like like the right word, because the monster kid of Undertale has always been like, yo man, come on dude, Undyne is so cool, extreme, radical, you know, in their dialogue. So their aged up version definitely perpetuates this energy through their lizardy mohawk and bling around their neck. Wait a minute, that bling is a cross, but the religion of Hometown is centered on the Deltarune. That's an entirely different symbol. There's no mention of Christianity in this game, I think. Though Father Alvin does imply that there are more religions than the angel-worshipping one. Does Monster Kid worship Jesus? Is Jesus in Deltarune? Is there a monster pope and a monster Vatican? Is Jesus Deltarune canon? Susie is the actual protagonist of Deltarune, and the reason I and so many other players feel this way is because of the sheer amount of character growth she has across chapters. Growth is the key. This growth is shown in so many ways, even with subtle stuff like the battle system. When Susie first joins the party, she's still a bit of an outsider, so she's placed at the bottom. But by the end of the chapter, at the final boss, she's grown so much in accepting her role as a hero that she's now placed second in initiative order, the center of attention, so to speak. Another point of growth? Eyes, of course. Susie's light world design makes it clear that she comes from some sort of poverty, with those ripped jeans, oversized jacket, and long, messy hair that covers her eyes, until it doesn't. Because the most impactful part of Chapter 1 is when Susie bravely defends Chris from the Chaos King, and most importantly, explicitly claims Chris as her friend. This is when she shows her eyes. Those windows to the soul are revealed. This simple addition of eyes widens Susie's range of expression from the creepy dinosaur bully persona she felt trapped in, to these goofy, Barney-esque faces, and yes, even some scrappy, shonen battle-esque hero smiles. This form of heroism was always with Susie in some way, though. Like, look at her Dark World form, specifically her belt buckle. See? She's had a heart of gold since the beginning. While we're on the subject of Susie's Dark World design, though, let's cover the color scheme. There's pink there, yes, a color associated with love, but the thing it has in common with her Light World design is that there's purple present as well. In Undertale, purple is the color associated with the soul trait Perseverance. It's also the trait Gerson himself assigns to Susie after defeating him. If you take multiple times and don't save scum, of course. And this moment means so much to me because perseverance as a soul trait is associated with books, language, and general academics in Undertale, the things that Susie believed she would never be good at. Gerson is able to teach her to deny that fate, and she gains more confidence, which tempers her healing magic, a skill that lets others persevere so that they can all work to shatter fate together. The wobbly things and dust piles in Deltarune's cliffs areas even characters? Well, apparently the game classifies them as darkness, so I'm gonna cover them. Wobbly thing is not a name I made up, by the way. They're literally called wobbly things in the game files, so their oblique nature is absolutely intentional. And yeah, it does appear utterly unclear what this thing is supposed to represent in the light world. It looks like some kind of mushroom to me, but even then, mushrooms have caps to them, while the wobbly just has a straight up sphere on the top of its stem thing. The wobbly things also introduce the mechanic that, unlike in Undertale's battle system, you can be damaged in the overworld. I mean, Undertale kind of had this when Undyne chases you, but those things still technically sent you into a battle. In any case, it's unclear whether firing these bullets is out of intent born from malicious sapience or a plant-like response like when a bug enters a Venus flytrap. The fact that they give off what sounds like high-pitched giggles does not help in clearing this up. The dust piles have their own eeriness to them, though. They're smoking entities that move up and down as if breathing. Look, there's even the vague shape of a mouth there. But the main quality of these guys is that they hold items for the player if you break them open, because, you know, forgotten items are often found in dusty places. Also, when you break open dust piles, they give off this weird, low-pitched groan. Similar to the wobbly things, the wiki itself states that it's unclear if the dust piles are sentient or not, which is creepy. I think that there's an intentional contrast between these designs too. They're both gray, but the wobblies are thin while the dust piles are fat. The wobblies are high-pitched while the dust piles are low-pitched, and the wobblies attack the player while the dust piles hold beneficial items for them. Basically, the contrast between high-pitched hostility and low-pitched indifference, gift-giving, works together to create an into the unknown vibe at a civilization's edge, building up a certain tension to Dark Worlds that gets immediately subverted in some ways, but also eventually affirmed in other ways. Ralsei is the third hero and prince of all darkners, of which there are none until you start recruiting them. Alone in deepest dark indeed, at least in the beginning. Anyways, onto design. Ralsei's hooded sprite is extremely, intentionally generic, matching the image in his opening monologue. Within the confines of Chapter 1's arc, I see it as set up for the reveal that Ralsei looks like and parallels Asriel in some way. But with the context of Chapter 4, we have this prophecy pane in the Dark Sanctuary, and it looks very much like Ralsei's initial sprite. Perhaps Ralsei, who knew the prophecy, wore this gray cloak as a form form of mental preparation, emulating the image that called him a hero to get himself ready to meet the other two heroes. Just speculation though. In any case, Ralsei's next design is the sprite he sports for the majority of Chapter 1, a design that remains present in the UI. With the hat that covers his horns, the scarf that wraps around his neck, chin, and shoulders, and the glasses that frame his face in lieu of putting more defined features there, Ralsei is a silhouette of a person. He's revealing more than his cloaked form, but there's still so much hidden. Secrets in the shadows, you could say. This, paired with his behavior, makes Ralsei a very androgynous boy, especially with his green cloak that looks like a dress. And with his shadow theming, he's an echo of someone familiar. Of Asriel, yes, but in Chapter 1, Ralsei also echoes the main themes of Undertale the game as a whole, at their most naive and least nuanced anyway. He views the world through a lens of kindness. It's no wonder the color of his clothes echo the soul trait of the same name in Undertale. But at the end of Chapter 1, Ralsei learns that it takes more than being a shadow of Undertale's themes to save the world. Susie herself says it best. It's complicated. There's nuance involved, just like in Undertale. Mercy doesn't equal servitude, a paradigm Ralsei still struggles with even in the most recent chapters, but I believe he's working on it. In any case, after this moment, with Lightners in his life, he gains the courage to take off his hat, leading us to his third design. And I think it's here I should address the main question. Is Ralsei an allegory representation of Asriel? He's no longer a shadow of Asriel, but there are certainly strong echoes of him still there. Look, his portrait sprite even changes from being at an angle to be front-facing, like Asriel's sprite in Undertale. And yeah, you could justify this as just a reuse of assets, but reusing an asset for one of the three main characters of the game is certainly notable and feels intentional. On the other hand, Chris seems to actively separate their brother from Ralsei, as shown in Chapter 4, where they actively point out Ralsei and Asriel's physical differences when showing a photo of Asriel to Susie. There's also that popular theory which states that Ralsei is a darkener of Chris's old horned headband, effectively making him Chris's monster Sona. So it's not incest, it's self-cest, an ideal sibling to Asriel instead of a direct allegory to him. So I guess, what's my answer? Is Ralsei Asriel? Is Deltarune's Prince of the Dark a direct reflection of Undertale's Prince of the Underground? I think yes, in a way, but also no, because he shouldn't be. Like, Ralsei's allowed to take cues and inspiration from other places, but he shouldn't put himself in a box, because he's Ralsei. Ralsei is Ralsei. Let me elaborate. Ralsei's main arc centers on his journey to find his own autonomy. He feels trapped by his knowledge of the prophecy, and he feels trapped about his own nature as a Darkner. In Chapter 3, he confidently, albeit sadly, states that he doesn't even see Darkners, and by extension himself, as real. But just because he's an illusion doesn't mean he doesn't matter. He might not be able to do activities in the light world, but that doesn't exclude him from personhood. He has his own thoughts, feelings, and features that make his identity go beyond that of Asriel or a horned headband. And most importantly, he has mutual relationships with others. He's affected the lives of the people around him. As Susie said, Ralsei is real to her. In Deltarune as a whole, the Fun Gang's fight against the prophecy is intrinsically linked to Ralsei's battle for his own personhood. So, despite the stark similarities to another Goat Boy, I choose to say that Ralsei is Ralsei. And yeah, isn't it genius indeed how this struggle for identity is present in both Ralsei's arc and his design? The Dummy is Deltarune Chapter 1's tutorial fight, and like Ralsei, also technically has three different designs. The first, default design, is the one the player battles with, and it's a spitting image of Chapter 1 Ralsei, albeit a bit flatter. Notice how it's outlined in white instead of dark green to portray said flatness. If you remember, the reason it looks like Ralsei and not blank like the dummies of Undertale is because Ralsei, as the Lonely Prince, didn't have any other image to base it on.
Cotton heart and button eye. Looks just like a fluffy guy.
But I find Ralsei's explanation curious in the context of his design from Chapter 2 onward, because when an Addison takes the clothes off of the dummy, its naked form is the same shadowy black as Chapter 1 Ralsei. Basically, the properties of the dummy don't match with the properties of Ralsei's body. The rule is that when Ralsei takes off his hat, his body inexplicably goes from being ink black fur to white fluffiness. Does Ralsei's personal hat hold special magical properties that the dummy's hat doesn't have? Actually, this entire part at the end of Chapter 1 gives me so many questions when I think about it, because the motion here implies that Ralsei had his sleeves over his hands the entire journey. journey, but that doesn't explain his legs. Was Ralsei wearing black boots in chapter 1? But that doesn't explain his face. Again, that hat is probably magic. Actually, now that I look at it, Ralsei's sleeves were green the entirety of chapter 1, and in this cutscene, they're black. What's up with that? Is Ralsei a shapeshifter of some kind? Does his struggle with identity extend to his physical appearance too? Is this something that he does consciously? I'm throwing out ideas here. Anyways, in chapter 4, the dummy is dressed up like this. With the long nose, rosy cheeks, and dollar sign necklace, I think that Addison's misspammed him dearly. But also, Ralsei informs us that he had nothing to do with this design, and honestly, I don't want anything to do with it either, so let's end the video now. The dummy may have been the tutorial fight, but Lancer is the first enemy you fight in Deltarune ever. And boy, and how come you can levitate? Where did that come from? The dummy may have been the tutorial fight, but Lancer is the first enemy you fight in Deltarune ever. And boy, he makes an impression. While Ralsei is the first Darkner to introduce himself, Lancer is the first Darkner you meet, albeit he's cloaked in shadow. But even then, you can still glean a sense of goofiness from his silhouette. He's short and stout with a pointy head. The little guy's even posed like a teacup, but the accompanying music, along with the rain of spades, is able to let Lancer have some level of menace before subverting it. But yeah, Lancer is an interesting intro to Darkners. Ralsei is a special case, I don't count him, because he showcases a new category of design. What I mean is, like, in Undertale and Deltarune, humans are children, monsters are mostly based off animals, and Darkners are based off objects. Fun fact, by the way, Lancer and quite a few Chapter 1 enemies were not designed by Toby Fox. Canotine's designs for these members of the Card Kingdom actually predate the development of Deltarune, and Toby worked with Canotine and got her permission to use her designs in the game. So yeah, that's why Lancer looks like something goofy, but relatively new for an Undertale audience that only in Chapter 1 to work with back in 2018. Like the fact that Chris can't tell where Lancer's clothes end and his body begins. This kid has action figure energy. Another thing that contributes to said energy is the fact that Lancer doesn't have a walk cycle. Like, sure, Toby Fox probably had him like this because it looked funny, and it does, but to me, I think this works to give Lancer this intentionally flat, card-like energy. He is based off the Jack of Spades, after all. And yet, despite these flat characteristics, Lancer is also canonically bouncy. Like, really bouncy. It's a contradiction, but an interesting one. I like to think that to lighteners like Chris and Susie, Lancer looks like he's two-dimensional from every angle, yet he still somehow exists and navigates in three-dimensional space. And yeah, I think stuff like this is yet again another example of how Darkners have shape-shifty properties, like this. I like to think that Lancer full-on morphing his face in this way for the sake of a bit isn't an exaggeration or a metaphor. It's something that's literally happening within the world. So yes, to me, Lancer has contradictory characteristics that work to introduce the wacky and dreamlike nature of Dark Worlds. In these alternate views of reality through lenses of shadow, imagination can supersede physics, which means a flat yet bouncy boy can ride a bike like a motorcycle simply by setting it on fire. Rudin is the first enemy the player meets in the Field of Hopes and Dreams, and I think he's a good design, both as a starter enemy and as a presentation of themes present in Chapter 1. As a starter enemy, like, look at him. Right off the bat, green is a friendly color. You could say it calls back to the idea of frogs, but also combined with a soft, slug-like shaped language, amicable smile, and comically small sword. Oh wait, no, that's a diamond-shaped dagger. Clever. Rudin gives off the strong impression of being an easy enemy character. And also, look at those eyes in his battle sprite. The way they oscillate up and down makes it look like he's under the influence, yes, but also that he's easily influenced. Rudin is an ambivalent character. In Undertale, you had to at least compliment Frogget to get it to stop attacking you, but with Rudin, convince is literally the first act option, and lecture is the second. This is wishy-washiness to a comedic degree. So yeah, the diamond serves a Dark King, but he will just as quickly abandon him. This characterization pushes the themes of mercy in Chapter 1 by showing just how brittle King's tyrannical leadership is. Because fear is a strong motivator. Pretty much everyone in the Card Kingdom fears King, from puzzle people to the King's own son. But this method does not incite long-lasting loyalty. Rudin fears King and works for him, but he doesn't care about him. He's more concerned with stuff like jewels or what to get Clover for her birthday. King is a problem that Rudin has to tolerate, not a person he has a relationship with. So honestly, I think this general attitude results in Rudin giving off the vibe of a retail worker. There are several moments in-game where Rudin is basically one step away from saying, I just work here, man. It's Rudin Ranger that at least looks more the part of a soldier. Their dull red coloring is less friendly than Rudin's green, and with their longer dagger, this is a Rudin who's climbed more of the corporate ladder compared to Rudin's retail worker energy. And with their large eyes covered by a visor, Rudin Ranger gives off the impression of being closed off, and by extension, harder to convince than regular Rudin. In theory, anyway. Deltarune is a compelling narrative, but especially in Chapter Chapter 1, it is nowhere near a difficult game at any point. Well, except for him, of course, but like, Top Chef is a perpetually distressed, spinny Italian man that the player meets in Deltarune's Field of Hopes and Dreams. He's also a victim of Susie's rampage throughout Chapter 1's Dark World, so his circumstances create the Broken Cake questline, which I'm not going to explain here because it barely makes sense even with context. I don't have much to say about this guy, but I do think it's notable how many contradictory characteristics Top Chef has. He's based off a top, and he makes cakes, but he looks like a pizza. His body language of spinning and posing is akin to a joyful dance, but he's constantly crying. He calls himself a chef, but he's esteemed for his baking abilities, and yes, there is a distinction between bakers and chefs. No wonder his spot at the top bakery was already taken by Malleus in Chapter 2. Get your name right, bro. It's Top Bakery, not Top Chefery. Top Chef has a notable speech quirk where he says "Mamma mia," which is an incorrect phrasing of "Mamma mia." If we take from the knowledge that Dark Worlds reflect the person who made them, I can see this as someone's incorrect approximation of what the Italian language is like. Imagination being limited by misunderstandings such as that. Actually, now that I think about it, does the existence of Top Chef mean that Italy is canon in Deltarune? The possibility of a monster pope and a monster Vatican becomes stronger.
Hey, why aren't you guys thrashed? You're totally outnumbered. You made a team of purely support enemies. Their bullet patterns aren't balanced at all. It's like a dinner made out of 3 glasses of milk. And that's, unusual somehow? Why don't we talk about this after the battle?
Hathy, like Rudin, is an enemy you meet on the Field of Hopes and Dreams, and I find her design pretty interesting. She's based off the heart suit of cards first and foremost, so her physical characteristics are kinda abstract to me in service of that heart aesthetic. Is she plant-like? She seems kinda slug-like, similar to Rudin, but no, that arm is too tendrilish to me to be a slug. Maybe those tentacly body parts make her a mollusk? I'm not sure, but what I do know for sure is that there's heart motifs all over her design, and that's what matters. Hathy has always struck me as somewhat inscrutable, and I think this is intentional. She's green like Rudin, but her smile seems more mischievous than his, and her lack of eyes compared to Rudin's big ones is certainly a contrast. Additionally, Hathy doesn't speak. Her emotions are gleaned through narration, and when she does have a speech bubble, she uses heart shapes in place of text. And I think these introverted traits, shall I say, relate to how King was able to terrorize and take over the Card Kingdom. If Rudin is ambivalent, then Hathy is someone who can't speak up for herself, especially to someone who doesn't care enough to parse her behavior. All in all, Hathy is a pretty reserved character, so Head Hathy takes these shy traits to turn this aloof characterization into something outright frigid. The blue color palette makes her look colder and less social, and the sneering mouth with the vampiric snaggletooth in place of regular Hathy's smile is a simple but effective way to make Head Hathy look more hostile. She's still very susceptible to flirting though, when it's from Chris. Susie and Ralsei make it awkward, but she still leaves the battle, so like, yeah, win's a win, you know? The Jigsaw are such hilariously, monumentally, charmingly pathetic characters. There's just so much about these guys that elicit pity. Like, when the player first meets the Jigsaw, it's when a couple of them have already been laid out onto the ground by Susie. And in terms of design, these guys look less like soldiers and more like reluctant sacrificial lambs. The shape of a puzzle piece is translated into floppy ears, stubby arms, and short legs. And that facial expression reaches Wojak meme levels of despair. And this characterization, yet again, goes to show how King was able to take over the Card Kingdom. Like Rudin is ambivalent, Hathy can't speak up for herself, and Jigsaw is completely and utterly terrified. There's quite a variety of characterization to be gleaned in how different Darkners respond to King's tyranny. The shadow of his rule affects everyone. It's a simple yet effective driving force of Chapter 1's narrative. There are a few Jigsaw who hold some amount of courage to fight against King though, albeit in their own way. The tutorial masters give out advice, for a small price, to the fun gang, mainly to spite King. These guys elicit pity in their own charmingly pathetic way though, especially Jigsaw Joe. With his beanie, tired eyes, visibly sunken cheeks, and stubble, I didn't know a puzzle piece could look so unemployed. The other tutorial masters don't look as burnt out as Jigsaw Joe, but they still have bags under their eyes, and an increasing number of beanies on their heads. The Chris Master has the most beanies. I wonder if that means anything? Despite all their pitiable qualities though, I do believe that the tutorial masters are stronger and more resilient people than me. Because like, if I got fired and my replacement was Rules Card of all people, I would have ended it all. Honestly, Sham was such a jump scare for me when I first met them. It does follow the mechanic from Undertale where entering a shop leads to this full-scale portrait thing instead of the usual top-down view. But in Undertale, the first shopkeeper you meet is a bunny woman with big lips backlit by a lantern, while in Deltarune, your first shopkeeper is a stitched-together cat person with a shadowed eye and an eerie smile. Sham's also more zoomed into the camera compared to the Snowden shopkeeper, so there's this feeling of suddenly getting too close that contributes to the jump scare energy as well, I think. In any case, Sham is a broken, nihilistic person, and this reflects in their design, with their injured, stitched-together nature, yes, but also the way that their purple fur splays out in different directions like an unkempt beard, and said fur having the same visual texture as their raggedy scarf. It all gives the strong impression of some old wizard or soldier being worn out from whatever dark world they came from. Another thing I want to point out is the fact that Sham is a stuffed animal. If you notice, I'd say the majority of monsters across Undertale and Deltarune, especially their main casts, are based off animals. So you could say that Sham's design borrows heavily from monster design philosophy, and yet they're not a monster. They're a darkener, close to real, related to a light world, but not part of it. And honestly, don't you think that that characteristic of Sham's foils Ralsei in a way? Ralsei is also connected to the light world in that he looks somewhat like a person from there, despite Chris's enthusiastic denial. But in the end, he's not that person, and Ralsei can't be a part of the light world in that way anyway. Another thing that connects these two is Sham's cotton insides and button eye. Cotton heart and button eye. You think Sham thinks themselves a dummy sometimes? Sham and Ralsei's characterizations branch apart though in their perspectives on the future, fate, and prophecy. In that, I'd say that Sham is akin to a bad future version of Ralsei. While Ralsei held this desperate, almost manic hope that the prophecy would change if he were kind enough, Sham enthusiastically, almost aggressively refuses to give a shit, finding some sick humor in the doom that seemingly awaits. Being unwilling to find hope doesn't mean that Sham is entirely opposed to it though. There are examples present in his Shadow Crystal dialogue that prove that. All in all, Sham, in both their design and their dialogue, add up to being one of the first explicit hints to the meta-narrative nature of Deltarune's story. One of the first, indeed. Deltarune's Pond Man is an enemy that the Fun Gang encounters on Chapter 1's Great Board, and in terms of design, yeah, that's a chess pawn. Blank white with stocky legs, an eye spot on its head, which doubles as a nucleus, which seems like a pretty exposed weakness, but whatever. This thing is described in-game as a simple organism that takes life one square at a time. Mr. Society says that the Pond Men are simple beings with no will of their own, attacking only because of King's orders. And yeah, the way that they're presented, they seem less like soldiers or even animals, and more like a function of the Great Board that King took advantage of. Like a gargoyle, really. Some territory-bound stone defender. Don't you think that the Great Board has a similarly ominous vibe to a Catholic cathedral? Eh? Okay, speaking of territory bound though, the Dark Pond Men of the Scarlet Forest serve a similar role. These guys are the area hazards that you encounter. The Dark Pond Man complements regular Pond Man's design by representing the opposite side of a chessboard. Regular Pond Men chasing the player could reference how white moves first in chess, and Dark Pond Men being a stationary hazard could reference how black moves last in chess. So yeah, these guys make for good set dressing, although maybe that's just a result of how they were treated by King in Chapter 1. Mere functions to serve his goals. Because in Chapter 4, a Pond Man is seen in Lancer's enrichment enclosure, tamping the soil. Lancer's a good boy, and so are the Pond Men, probably. They comprehend the concept of mercy better than some other entities, at the very least. Mr. Elegance and Mr. Society are chess piece people that you meet in Deltarune Chapter 1's Great Board, and honestly, their designs are kind of meh to me. They're both based off chess pieces. They're the knight and bishop counterparts to the Pond Men's pawn inspiration, but the blank white color scheme with simple appendages worked for the Pond Men because they were silent, inscrutable creatures that King forced into being gargoyle-style attack dogs. That same blank white design just reads as kind of boring on characters who are supposed to have more fleshed out personalities. Like, Mr. Elegance is more based off the horse shape of the knight chess piece than knights as a concept, and Mr. Elegance looks less like a bishop and more like a fancy coat rack, like a fancier version of the actual royal coat rack. The most notable part about these guys, though, is that their names are oxymorons. Mr. Elegance talks like a country bumpkin, and Mr. Society is very much willing to not be social at the drop of a hat. I like Mr. Society more than Mr. Elegance because Society's characterization highlights how King's tyranny affects different people, while Mr. Elegance kind of just has a one-note joke about nostril eyes. Also, it's hard for me to read his dialogue. So yeah, these two are unremarkable characters, but otherwise innocuous. Checkers Round as a design is the embodiment of little guy energy. Look at this guy. This thing has one brain cell and it's powered by bouncy vibes. Its check dialogue is, despite appearances, it's trying its best to defeat you. This design is like if you turned a golden retriever into a disc. Look, it even has the same face sprite work as the dog characters in Undertale. So, as a character, this little guy energy is used to expose just how much growing up Susie needs to do as a person in Chapter 1. She starts off as an irresponsible mean girl murder hobo, beating up everything she sees, including something as vulnerable as C-Round. But as the story progresses, and especially when she starts connecting with Lancer, Susie's world expands and she's able to learn other ways to fight. Which brings us to King Round, the powered-up form of Checkers Round when they reach the end of the Great Board, or when Rules Card uses his control craft. First of all, those legs go crazy! The juxtaposition of that simple dog-like face with such realistic and well-defined calves is both really funny and mildly terrifying. It's a good reminder that humor and horror function on very similar rules. Like, imagine an infant with incredible Hulk legs. You gotta admit it's an unnerving dichotomy. Anyways, this is such a meme of a boss fight. You beat K-Round the first time by socially pressuring it into reciprocating a bow multiple times. It can shoot stars from its toes for some reason. It heals with a low-quality PNG of milk. This sprite exists. Like, in general, it's great. And again, K-Round as a character exposes Susie's character growth, because the second time you fight it, Susie has learned to not deny her unhinged energy, but apply it more creatively instead of violently for the sake of her friends. It's such charming writing, and the origin of an iconic meme, hell yeah. Oh hey, you made it to the end of the video. Yeah, I was planning on uploading a compilation to my channel only after I had reviewed every character featured in Deltarune Chapter 1, but I got monetized recently and, well, I need money, so. Anyways, let me chill for a bit now that you're here. There are memberships on this channel. It's a single tier at 99 cents. If you want to give me money more directly, I have a Ko-Fi linked below where you can give me a one-time donation, minimum $1. I should really make a Patreon. I have plans for that, I just haven't done it because and of course, if you don't have anything to spare, that's completely fine. The world's a crazy place right now, to say the least. There are ways to support me for free. Share this video, leave a comment, and watch another video of mine if you can. It does good stuff for the algorithm, or so I've heard. There should be a link in the corner right now that leads to a video of me talking about Megalovania. I had fun making that one. In any case, thanks for watching, and stay starry, folks.